Is that going right? Okay.
Need the lights off?
It was kind of dark outside. I don't know if it would have been too much. I think you can see it okay on the phone. So we'll risk it. Recap as to where we are, really quick. So we're talking about Plato. Today we're going to talk about his ethics, but let's really quick remind ourselves of his metaphysics and his epistemology. So first off, what is reality for Plato?
It's the world of forms and the world of particulars.
Perfect. There's the world of forms and the world of particulars. So down here in the world of particulars, there exists you, there exists me, there exist chairs. Up here, there exists chairness, there exists manness, there exists all these forms. Now, up here in the world of forms, down here we see all men are mortal. Since we can make that logical connection down here, that means up here in the world of forms, there's actual structure that exists between the mortality form and the manness form. And so all the forms up here, they're not just forms sitting there disconnected from each other. There's a big logical structure so that all the forms are somehow connected together in this big web-like structure. What the actual structure is, we don't know. But at the very base of the structure, we do know what that basic form is. The form that we can derive everything else from. And what's that basic form? The form of the good. So there's the form of the good. So we have the world of forms, we have this world. The world of forms is somehow reflecting or projecting itself into the void, creating 3D objects here. And so we are all just images, projections of the manness form. Now, you and I are different from that chair, though. So that chair is a projection of the chairness form. So all we can say is that that thing is essentially a chair. We don't say that you are essentially a man according to Plato. What's your essence?
The third man.
Your soul. So you possess a soul, which makes you different from that chair. You are essentially your soul. And so your soul is an essence. And so your soul exists or has an element of this up here. And so what Plato thought happened is, getting to his epistemology, your soul is immortal, it's your essence. Here's where essences exist. Your soul existed up here. You came into contact with the world of forms. Your soul isn't the same thing as these other universals, but it is an essence. So it exists up there. You came into contact with these things, came to know the forms somehow, and then your soul, through a process of birth, comes down here into you. And so, you participate in a manness form, but on top of that, you have a soul. And so everything that can act for itself has a soul. So that chair doesn't have a soul, but you, a lion, animals basically, they all have souls. Anything that can act for themselves. And you are essentially your soul. Your soul is the essence of you. That's an important piece to get for what's coming up with his ethics here. Let's see, anything else? I think that pretty much covers it up to here. That all makes sense?
What about learning things?
Oh, perfect. So learning things, yeah. So you were in contact with the forms up here, and you were, in a sense, omniscient, or at least potentially omniscient. You come down here, going through the process of birth, your soul going through birth, somehow causes you to forget everything you knew. And so all knowledge, all learning, is really just recollection. You recollect what it is you knew. And so you remember last week, I walked you guys through the proof that the angle sum of any triangle is 180 degrees. And I did it in such a way that I never actually told you anything. I just asked you questions, and by you answering the questions, you reproduced the proof. Odds are, most of you, if not all of you, forgot that proof again. And so even though you once knew it, you currently can't recall it. But I could start walking you through the steps again, and you say, oh yeah, I remember. Oh yeah, I remember. Okay, yeah, now I get it. So all knowledge for him is recollection. The reason that it's recollection is because our soul is immortal. Always existing, it was there, that's where we learned everything. And so everything we know is somehow innate in us already. Our soul came into contact with it. Okay, good. Anything else on those? So with that, let's jump into his ethics. Now, remember that ethics is all Socrates was targeted at when he was giving his philosophy. Socrates didn't try to come up with an epistemology. He didn't try to come up with a metaphysics. He was just developing an ethics. And so Plato, in constructing this whole framework, he's out to do two things. He's out to vindicate Socrates' belief in the absolute and objective good, truth, and beauty, and he's out to support his ethics. So he's just going to flat out piggyback on Socrates' ethics. So we're going to go over, every time I have Socrates up here, we're going to go over Socrates' ethics, and then we're going to see how Plato extended it, tying it in to his overall philosophy, and how it all ties into the system. So that's what we're going to do here. So remember that ultimately Plato is out to establish Socrates' ethics. So obviously their ethics are going to be almost identical. Plato just takes it further. Recall that Socrates was ultimately out for an objective and absolute code of ethics. Right? And what did he think? He thought if we could come up with the reason. Why did Socrates think that everyone was collapsing into this moral decay?
Because they lack a true definition of things.
Yeah, they don't have any definition for what it is that they're talking about. All these definitions are about universals. If you can know the universals, then you can start to establish universal knowledge, objective and absolute knowledge about what is the good thing, the right thing to do. So keep in mind with Socrates, when we say that it's objective and absolute, the same way that 4 plus 4 is 8. Either you know it or you don't. Your opinion on 4 plus 4 being 8 is completely irrelevant. It is what it is. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't. In like manner, the right thing is the right thing. Period. Maybe you know it, maybe you agree that it's the right thing, maybe you don't. You may be more or less moral. But the right is the right, whether you accept it or not, whether you think it is or not. So that's what we mean by objective and absolute. So the Sophists viewed any system of ethics as a collection of preferences and or conventions. Why do we do things? Well, because that's just the way we prefer to do things. It's not that there's any nature. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with me robbing you. It's just we happen to prefer, in our culture here, to not rob each other. Or it's some convention that's passed down to us that someone just adopted. And so it's just kind of like a fad. It's the way the people that did it before us do it, and so we just keep doing it the way that they did it. So these things just exist by convention. There is nothing either good or bad, but man's thinking makes it so. There is no objective and absolute ethics. And so how ought you to behave if everything's just your preferences?
What's good for you at the moment?
Indulge your preferences. If you desire something, satisfy that desire. If you think something will cause you pain, don't let it. Avoid it. Seek pleasure, avoid pain. That's the ethics that they put forward. What happens if your desires and my desires conflict with each other?
Might makes right.
Might makes right. You better have a bigger stick than me. So that's the Sophists. So Socrates viewed ethics as being closer to a science than this amalgam of preferences and predilections. It's not just about your desires. It's not just about what you prefer. It's an actual science. And there is a right way to live your life, and there is a wrong way to live your life. Your preferences don't matter. Now, he often made analogies between the health of the body to the health of the soul. So as gymnastics and medicine are to the body, so ethics is to the soul. Now, when he talks about gymnastics here, he means something broader than what we think of. We think of a particular exercise form. He means all exercise taking care of your body. This would also include things like a healthy diet. That would come under this category. Taking care of your body. Medicine is curing your body of whatever disease it happens to take in. So, kind of broader than what we might be thinking of. So, as gymnastics and medicine are to the body, so ethics is to the soul. There's a science about how you have a healthy soul, the same way that we have these sciences about how you have a healthy body, how to take care of the body. So, how would these things come to go? He would say, consider the health of the body. By nature, the body needs gymnastics. It needs physical exercise. It needs a particular type of diet. This isn't just a convention. It's not by convention that you need water. By nature, you need water. So by nature, the body needs gymnastics and medicine. This is both the preventing and curing of elements. And so these are the associated sciences for determining what is good and bad for the body. It's not a matter of your preference. Since these are sciences, and not just a matter of opinion or convention, then they must have an objective metric for determining what is good and bad for the body. And what is that metric? The health of the body. So, give you a quick example. I might say, getting intoxicated every night is a good thing because it gives me a lot of pleasure. I might say that's a healthy thing for me to do. It's what I prefer to do. Well, the fact of the matter is it's killing my liver. And so I might be sitting here all jaundiced with a dying liver saying, nope, this is what's good for me. It's just my preference. I know you think I need to stop, but that's just what you prefer me to do. This is my health. Right? So, the same way, those are sciences, he's going to argue that ethics is a science. Therefore, it is universally true that in order to maintain a healthy body, one must exercise reason and self-control, as opposed to satisfying your arbitrary desires. If you sit there and you eat that cake, and you sit there and you eat that cake, and you sit there and eat that cake, might sure taste good, you're satisfying those desires, but you're making yourself unhealthy. It's not a matter of opinion. You're obese. It's killing you. You're getting diabetes. We had to take your left foot. Sorry. So there's an objective metric for determining what is good and bad for the body, i.e. the health of the body. That's how we determine whether something is actually doing you good or doing you evil. And so we can start determining which things do you good and do you evil. We can say, is water actually good for the body? I don't know. Let's not give someone water for a sec. Let's see what happens. Oh, he died. Okay, water is good for the body. So you can start testing when you have some objective metric to fall back on. Can you really eat too much? Is it really bad to just eat as much as you want? I don't know. Let's see what happens. Oh, yep, it is. And so when you have some objective metric, you can start determining what is actually good for the body and what is actually bad for the body. So if something is good or bad by nature, there has to be some objective metric that we can use to determine it, and then we can start classifying things as good or bad. In the same way that there's objective principles of medicine and gymnastics, so too are there objective principles of ethics. So says Socrates. We know the metric by which we can test the principles of medicine and gymnastics is just to the extent that it produces or destroys health in the body. But by what metric can we test a principle of ethics? His answer, happiness. Happiness is going to be the metric. Now, the actual Greek word that he uses is eudaimonia. It's typically translated as happiness, but these translations predate psychology. Psychology has kind of hijacked this word happiness. What does it mean to be happy? It means some sort of satisfying feeling in the moment. That is not at all what people meant when they were first translating this word. So modern translators, rather than translating eudaimonia as happiness, they instead translate eudaimonia as the condition of a human flourishing. Try and give you a little bit of contrast here. This is just to give you intuition. We're going to step away from Socrates' philosophy for a second. So, there you are. It's the end of a school day. You got your homework. Or you can go watch Netflix. What are you going to do? You can do your homework or you can watch Netflix. Which of those are going to be more enjoyable to you in the moment? The Netflix. And so if you turn on that Netflix and you're enjoying the good show, someone might say, hey, you happy right now? Oh yeah, this is great. Whereas if you instead chose to do the homework and you're struggling through that homework problem, so you happy right now? No, this is frustrating. I don't know what's freaking going on here. It's annoying. And so, in that sense, the psychologist might say, no, we're probably happier with the Netflix. However, if you rather think to yourself, not what do you want to do, but what do you want to have done, then you'll have a better understanding of this. So imagine now you can fast forward to the end of the evening, and I said, okay, the evening's over. What do you wish you would have done? Watched Netflix or done your homework? You say, I wish I would have done my homework. So if you think in terms of doing what you want to have done, rather than doing what you want to do, you get a better notion for this. Because when you do what you want to have done, why do you want to have done your homework? Because you expect it to have long-term positive consequences. Whereas watching the Netflix, doing what you want to do, has no long-term consequences. No long-term positive consequences. And so if you live a life where you sit here and you do these things that have positive long-term consequences, your life starts flourishing a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. Once you do a bunch of those throughout your life, you're now living a flourishing life. That was just intuition, give you a sense of what they're going for here. That's what we're talking about with happiness. So it's not feeling good. It's not a feeling. So what is our metric now? It's happiness for if a principle of ethics is doing you good, and misery. So happiness and misery are the consequences of right and wrong ethical action. If you cultivate virtue, excellences, then you increase the health and well-being of your soul, thereby producing happiness. Maybe talk a little bit about this word virtue because I think it comes up a lot. Maybe go back to our picture that we had here. So when we say by nature you are a man, let's think about a knife for a second. When we say that something is essentially a knife, what are we saying? It participates in the form of knifeness. And there's better reflections of knife, better projections of knifeness, and worse projections of knifeness. And what are the better projections like?
They can cut better.
They can cut better, so that's going to be one thing. So we say an ability to cut well is one of the excellences of a knife. Maybe durability is another excellence of a knife. And so it's more excellent in terms of the virtues of a knife, the excellences of a knife. So in like manner, madness, if it exists by nature, then madness has its own excellences. And so that's what we mean here by virtue. Virtue, the virtue of a man is his excellences. So you often hear things like patience is a virtue. It's one of the excellences of a man. It's one of the ways a man can be excellent. And so we're going to be talking about virtue as opposed to vice. In short, virtues are going to be positive characteristics. Vices are going to be negative characteristics. A virtuous person is a person who has cultivated a lot of virtues. A vicious person is a person who has cultivated a lot of vice. So that's what we mean by virtue and vice here.
Since I stepped out for a bit, I just want to clarify positive, negative, right and wrong. Where did we define what those are before we define happiness?
So right means you did the action that you ought to have done. Wrong means that you did the action that you ought not to have done. How do we know if you did the action that you ought to have done? It produces happiness. That's the metric. How do we know that you did the action that you ought not to have done? It produces misery. That's the metric.
Okay.
And so here's our objective metric from which we can construct this science of ethics. Happiness and misery. If you cultivate virtue, the excellences of a man, if you cultivate those virtues, if you cultivate virtue, you will increase the health and well-being of your soul, thereby producing happiness. In similar manner, if you cultivate vice, then you will become more miserable. And so here's our great test. And here's how we can start classifying things. How do we know if something's a virtue? Have a bunch of people exhibit it and see if it makes them happy or if it makes them miserable. If it makes them happy, it must be a virtue. If it makes them miserable, it must be a vice. So, therefore, there are objective principles by which happiness is cultivated. Your opinion as to what will make you happy is as irrelevant as your opinion as to what will cure your disease. Doctor says, well, it looks like you have cancer. You say, great, I'm going to go eat a burger. That should solve it. Now, you can do surgery or chemo treatment, he might tell you. Say, I don't really prefer those. The burger sounds better to me. Let's do that. You can do what you want, but it's not going to cure your disease. Your opinion as to what will cure your disease is completely irrelevant. Or you might go stand by some crystals or, I don't know, do a rain dance, whatever you do to try and cure your cancer. The point is, your opinion, even if you sincerely believe it, is completely irrelevant. There's the thing that will cure the cancer and the things that won't. There's the things that will make you a happier person and the things that won't. Your opinion, irrelevant. So in the same way that only those who understand the principles of medicine can say what will and will not produce health in some individual, so too only those who understand the principles of ethics can say what will and will not produce happiness in an individual. Someone might think something will produce happiness for him and then go get that and end up miserable. So you can be mistaken. It's not a matter of just satisfying your preferences. Therefore, happiness is definitely not the consequence of satisfying your arbitrary desires. And not only is happiness not the consequence of that, this can often even lead you to become miserable. You have a strong desire for food, you keep eating, you keep eating, you keep eating, you end up morbidly obese. No one says, oh yes, there's a happy person. Or chasing wealth all the time, getting that money, becoming a miser. No one looks at a miser and says, oh, what a happy person, as they hoard up all their wealth and never even get to enjoy using the wealth to accomplish anything. Or the famous person, they spend their whole life in the pursuit of fame. How many times does that fame turn around and make them miserable? How many times do you hear about famous people killing themselves intentionally or unintentionally? In an attempt for some sort of escapism from the very fame that they spend their life chasing.
So we're looking at always the end result, however long that might be, when it comes to determining whether or not their choices led them to be happy and that those choices were in fact good choices.
Correct. So look at someone who, if we think something's going to make you happy, let's see an example of it and see what happens. The same way that the same way that you associate certain things with health and certain things with bad health, good health and bad health. How do you come up with those associations? You watch certain actions taken by people and you see what it produces. And if it seems to produce someone that's unhealthy, you say, nope, that's unhealthy behavior. If it seems to produce someone that's healthy, you say, hey, that's healthy behavior. And so if you look at the patterns of behavior that lead to these types of people, then you say, okay, those are obviously bad patterns of behavior because those people are obviously miserable. Someone who let their desire for food control their life, or someone who let their desire for wealth control their life, or someone who let their desire for fame control their life. That one single desire. Which is a type of person which is a type of life that you could justify using a sophist ethics. Satisfy that desire. One of the sophists talks about how the greatest joy in life would be having a really long neck. So you could taste that food going all the way down and just keep on tasting that food. To always be desiring and always be satisfying the desire. That's the ideal life for a sophist. Okay, since happiness is a product of cultivating virtue, and since no one can rob you or provide you with virtue, you are the only one who can make yourself happy. So think about how contrary this is to basic things we see in our culture. Guy marries girl because she makes me happy. He makes me happy. Socrates says, what a bunch of nonsense. No one can make you happy but you. Marrying that person doesn't make you cultivate virtue. Similarly, since no one can force or cause you to cultivate vice, you are the only one who can make yourself miserable. And so the couple later decides that they're going to divorce each other. Why? We're making each other miserable. Socrates says, what a bunch of nonsense. You're making yourself miserable. I'm not surprised, because you thought that person would make you happy. Turns out, you're the only one who can do that. So, happiness is a consequence of your own actions, and misery is a consequence of your own actions. This means that no one can really do you any harm, and no one can really do you any good, with the exception of yourself. In this very deep way, no one can really get to you, and you can already see with those three things, if you're already familiar with it, the foundation of the Stoic ethics.
He means harm in the sense of
Making you miserable.
miserable and happiness.
Misery is a consequence. There's a difference between being miserable and experiencing pain. Right?
It's true.
You can watch a dad playing with his kids and, oh, got a cramp on my leg. He's still having a good time with his kids, but he's in pain. Difference between being in pain and being miserable, the same way that there's a difference between experience that titillation and being happy in this deep sense.
Gotcha.
You might have a pleasant experience watching the Netflix. It's not making you happier. You had a very painful experience doing the homework. It was making you happier. So yeah, maybe harm was a bad word there. Any real harm, maybe I should have said. Can't get to you. Any real harm because it can't hurt that real thing.
Yeah.
The soul, because we talked about the health of the soul.
Bodily harm.
That's what ethics is. Bodily harm isn't real though, right? Here we are, projections in this nothingness.
Can he take these to extremes in the sense that your environment is never the factor that determines whether or not you'll be happy? In the sense that you can be in prison, you can be tortured,
This is
you can be
wasted.
all these things, and I'm just saying, is that what he's saying, right?
That's what he's saying.
Gotcha.
So yes, in this deep sense, no one can ever really get to you. If you've got that perfectly healthy soul, no matter what someone tries to inflict upon you, you're still going to be happy. You may be in pain, but you'll be happy. In similar manner, you think about, if you can think all the way back to when we were talking about Thrasymachus, and he talked about how the tyrant lives this happy life because they're able to experience all these pleasures. If you're completely miserable, and yet you can satisfy any desire you have and have all this pleasure, you're still deeply miserable. So a miserable person experiencing all the pleasure you can imagine is still miserable, and a completely happy person experiencing all the pain you can imagine is still a happy person.
Does he take into account situations where one person could be doing one thing and be very happy about it, and it continually, sustainably providing happiness for him, and another person doing the same thing is not giving happiness?
Kind of. So there's a principle to it. The same way that I can hurt my health by eating the exact same diet as you.
Yes.
So the principle isn't eat these chicken wings. Eat this many chicken wings each night for dinner. The principle is eat your food in moderation. And so it's not the exact same actions will make you and me both happy people, but it's the exact same principles guiding our actions will make you and me happy people. So, give you one example. He thinks that you being punished for committing an injustice is somehow curing your soul. And it's actually doing you good, making you happy. And so, if you went and committed a crime, it may be a good for you to suffer. Whereas me suffering, if I didn't commit the same crime, it's not really doing me any good.
Is that
Just one example of what he talks about.
Is that because it gets rid of your guilt?
We'll get into, he thinks it's somehow teaching you. But he thinks that being punished for your crimes is a good thing, and it actually helps to improve you. He thinks it's an educational process, and it teaches you to do better. All right, so second thing to know is that happiness is an achievement with the Greeks, and with Socrates here. You don't have a happy child. They don't have a flourishing life. They're a child. In like manner, you don't have a miserable child. A child is a child. Happiness is an achievement. It's something you work up to by cultivating these virtues. So happiness is an achievement and the end of a completely moral life, and not some momentary sensation.
How do you experience happiness within?
Huh?
How do you experience the achievement of happiness if you're dead?
How do you experience the achievement? Well, first off, he's going to say your soul's immortal.
Yeah.
So he believes in the cycles of reincarnation and that you can
eventually get there.
eventually break the cycle and somehow exist in some, I don't know what it is, but some almost godlike state somehow. I don't know how it all comes together. So there is that way, but happiness is an ethical state that you are improving upon. And so you're becoming more and more happy with time. And so the happiness you achieve is something that's cultivated with respect to time, depending on if you're spending that time cultivating virtues. Misery is also cultivated with respect to time. I should say it's impossible for a young person to be happy, but it would be very, 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 very strange. The same way it would be very, 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 very strange to find a young person who's miserable. Now, an older person who's miserable, nothing surprising about that. And an older person who's happy, nothing surprising about that. And you can probably think of people in your own life. So, happiness is an achievement at the end of a completely moral life. And at the end of a completely moral life, maybe that's where I threw you off, the end as in the thing being desired all the time. The thing that you're targeting at. The end of you getting a job is making money.
Gotcha.
So should be a little bit careful there. Not the thing experienced at the end of a completely moral life, although that would also be the case. It's the end being targeted at. So happiness is an achievement at the end of a completely moral life, and not some momentary sensation. So he's completely opposed to the notion that happiness is a string of exciting events, which is the way you typically see it in pop culture. You go from doing this fun thing to that fun thing to that fun thing to that fun thing. Always looking for the next distraction. Not for him. Now, ideally, it's nice, but not necessary to have all the comforts of life. And the virtuous person is far more likely to have them than the vicious person.
Why?
Because he says all the good things in life are a consequence of some virtuous action. You get wealth. You have to be virtuous to ultimately produce that wealth. You could have stole it from someone, but then someone else had to produce that wealth. So it's good for you to have wealth. And if you live a virtuous life, you're more likely to have wealth than if you live a completely vicious life. Now, that's not to say that there aren't extremely vicious people with a ton of wealth. All he's saying is that, as a general rule, your people who live more virtuous lives have the goods of life. Because the goods are ultimately produced through some virtuous action. If you're a virtuous person, then obviously you're going to work hard at whatever your profession is, and so you're likely to cultivate a good amount of wealth. If you're a virtuous person, you're more likely to have a good reputation amongst people around you than people who are always lying and trying to get ahead. Some of them might get ahead, and some of them might even get ahead for a while. Oftentimes it comes back and it collapses in on them, though. And they end up much worse off than if they've just been honest the entire time. So when it comes to having a good family, cultivating wealth, good reputation amongst the people around you, as a general rule, the virtuous life gets those things anyways. So Socrates says, he would tell you, first off, you should cultivate virtue because what's important is your soul. The stuff in this world, who cares? And then even if you are focused on the things in this world, it's still the better option. So it's his backup plan with these yous that he's talking to. You should do it for this reason. If that doesn't get you, do it for the very reasons that you're considering pursuing vice for anyways. That make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So if happiness is a product of cultivating virtue, what then are the virtues and how are they cultivated? Now, how do we test if something's a virtue?
That's what you do.
You watch someone who implements that particular thing in their life, and you see, is it making them in general happier or more miserable? Same way you test to see if something is conducive to health in the body. So, the 4 chief virtues recognized by the Greeks were wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice, and that's how they came to identify these things as being virtues. So, here's our 4 chief virtues. Socrates thinks if you cultivate these things, then you will for sure have a healthy soul, and therefore experience happiness. Now, we gotta define exactly what these things are and how we cultivate them. So, Socrates believed that not only was knowledge a necessary condition for obtaining virtue, as is the case with medicine. How can you know how to cure a disease if you don't have the knowledge of medicine in you? So, Socrates believed that not only was knowledge a necessary condition for obtaining virtue, but that it is also a sufficient condition for obtaining virtue. So, here's where he's going to be a little bit weird here. He's going to say that virtue is knowledge. Now, I'll take you through his argument for that in a second, but we've already come across this when we went over the Protagoras. So recall that in the Protagoras, wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice were all shown to be the same thing. That's one of the things that they did in the Protagoras, and therefore, all the virtues are the same thing as wisdom or knowledge.
Wisdom is the same thing as knowledge.
Basically. So that's the connection that he made to say that all virtues are really knowledge. Because they're all really wisdom, and if anything can be taught, wisdom can be taught. And what can be learned is not knowledge. So all the virtues are really knowledge, and that's one of the places where he gives you a taste for that argument that we've already come across, and I tried to tie it together when we went over it. So this means that if you truly know what is right, you will necessarily do the right thing, and that all evil is done in ignorance.
Why does that apply? Why does that imply that? Why can't you know what the right thing is and do the wrong thing?
Because having the virtue is the same thing as knowing the virtue.
It is.
That's what he's saying here. So here's what he thinks is impossible for you to do. It is impossible for you to truly believe that doing A will make you happier, will be more beneficial for you, and choose B anyways. The only reason that you ever choose to do a cowardly thing is because you actually mistakenly think that that will improve you more. And if you actually understood the facts as they are, you would always do the courageous thing.
This would imply that people don't really have a choice.
This would imply people don't really have a choice.
Yeah, because if they have the knowledge, then
They have a choice as to what they learn.
I don't know. If they know true and it was going to make them happy, then they would have done it. But because of their ignorance, they remained ignorant.
Let me try and give you an analogy. Let's say that you were sincerely trying to get a good score on a test. If you knew how to solve the problem, you would always put the right answer. That doesn't mean that you didn't have any choice about it. You could have studied harder. You could have thought harder. You could have made that connection at the right time in the right place. So it's still possible to get the wrong answers. But if you know the right answer, then you're going to put the right answer. So you still have a choice as to whether or not you learn these things. But if you know it, it's impossible for you to act against it. It would be kind of like once I teach you how to read, for you to look at these letters and not see the word. You can't help but see the word once you know what the word is. A little child can come and look at that and they just see a bunch of things and they cannot see the courage there. But now you're to the point where it's impossible for you to see that and not see courage. You now know the word.
Yep.
Coming up with analogies on the fly.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Now, what it does show, and one of the ways that his ethics is often criticized, is that there's no such thing as intentionally doing an evil thing.
Yeah. Right.
So how do you punish someone for doing an evil thing if they never did it intentionally? If I accidentally did something wrong, then you should just correct me, and you should have taught me to do better. There's no reason to go punish me for it. I didn't mean to do the wrong thing. It was an accident. If I had known, I would have done the right thing. So how are we ever justified in punishing a person for doing the wrong thing? Well, Socrates says, punishing is teaching him. That's what punishment is.
Yeah, I mean, everything he's saying lines up with my beliefs.
He sure sounds that way a lot.
Yeah.
It's so easy to read Plato's dialogues and get sucked in. And I always have to take some steps back and be like, wait a second. But it is very easy to follow along with the thinking.
I would argue that it's just, I still think that he's implying that people really don't, they're almost mechanical in the sense that they would have done right if they would have only known, and they would have become unignorant if they'd only known that that was the thing that would have made them more happy.
Does he mean?
On and on and on. And that punishment is actually a great way to teach. And so all of that plays into the sense that there's still, that doesn't necessarily indicate that he thinks that there really is this, that really somebody can do something intentionally wrong, and that they have a choice in that.
If I force somebody to learn the right thing, am I taking away their choice?
If you force someone, I don't think, so he doesn't think that you can force anyone to learn anything. So you can punish someone and they can still refuse to learn. So a punishment is he views you getting punished similar to me giving you a lecture. And you can choose to ignore it. But it was an attempt to try and teach you. That's what punishment is. All punishment is an attempt to try and teach. And so even when you go through life, because he believes in these cycles of reincarnation, you'll be punished for what you did here in the world of particulars when you die. But the punishment is to try and cure your soul. Is to try and teach your soul. And so ultimately your soul's going to go through all these cycles over and over again until finally it learns everything it needs to learn and breaks the cycle. So that's what we're out to do. Now, it's kind of hard to tie all that together with how he thinks about your essence being here. It's exposed to everything, so isn't your soul already perfect when it was born? Somehow there's this development of the soul that goes on in these reincarnation cycles. And I don't pretend to completely understand everything he's saying.
I mean, it makes sense that punishment should be a form of education and never as a form of vengeance or to want them to suffer for the sake of suffering. I think that's...
Most people would say, number one reason to punish is to prevent other people from performing the behavior.
That also works.
You can't let person A get away with it because B, C, and D will then all say, oh, so we can get away with it.
That's a double benefit in some cases.
So There's punishing them, doing them good, but also punishing them to prevent other people from committing the same wrong.
Doing society good?
Sure. Okay. Okay, so yes, knowing the virtue and being and having the virtue are one and the same. So proof that virtue is knowledge, here's not a particular one, but usually when he gives the proof, here's the outline, it typically follows. Everyone necessarily pursues their own advantage and ultimately their own happiness. Anytime you choose A over B is because you truly believe A will be better for you than B.
So I cannot make a choice that I know will be bad for me.
You cannot make a choice that you know will be bad for you. If you're sitting there and you're like, Netflix, I was going to use get intoxicated one night. You truly believe that the pleasure of that intoxication is worth the pains or the risks of whatever comes involved. It's worth the risk somehow. It's worth the pain somehow. It's worth the consequence somehow. And so overall, you gained more than you lost.
But like, what about suicide? If I believe there's no afterlife, what kind of justification would there be that? 'Cause
The state of nothingness that you think you're going into is superior to the misery of the life you're currently living.
Yeah.
So it would still be perceived as this is a
It's
better
better.
choice than this.
Yeah.
It's a lesser two evils in a sense.
So he thinks that everyone is always pursuing what they think will make their lives better. Whether it actually will or won't
It's irrelevant.
is irrelevant, yeah. But you are always pursuing what you think will actually make you happier. When you chose to watch that Netflix over doing your homework, you truly believe that the pleasure of watching that Netflix will be worth the pains of not having done your homework that come down the road. And in the end, it's worth it. And who knows? You probably won't even check homework tomorrow. So we can take the risk. Or whatever it is. So that's his basic premise in his thinking here. So now, anyone who comprehends a virtue and understands how it will lead to their own happiness necessarily pursues it. To do otherwise would be willfully pursuing something to your disadvantage. So if you truly understand that virtue and how it is an excellent a man and leads to happiness, you can't help but do it. So knowing the virtue and having the virtue are going to be the same. So then, anyone who commits an evil or vicious action is simply ignorant of the associated virtue. If they only knew how they were hurting themselves, they'd change and perform virtuous actions instead.
So, he's saying no, and I'm not sure if he means like knowledge in the same way that we use knowledge. Because I can know that getting intoxicated will be bad for me in the long term, but I still want to do it. And I know that it's bad for me.
So you know it's going to likely have these negative side effects. And you know it's going to have these short-term positive side effects that you want.
Yeah.
And so you truly believe that those positive short-term side effects are worth the long-term negative risks. Otherwise you wouldn't do it. So says Socrates.
So somebody who's doing that doesn't truly know the bad consequences.
They don't really believe it, they don't really buy it, or they put a premium on immediate pleasure is more valuable than distant pain, however bad the pain. And so they think it's truly worth it. It's truly to their advantage. In that instant, at that time, they are in a better state for having done it.
They say that the only reason people do change is through discovery that the cost was outweighing the benefit of a choice. And that's the only way people change.
It's definitely a common way people change, which is why this appeals to our intuition so much. There's also other ways like punishment. You go around stealing all the time. I finally go get a gun and say, next time you do that, I'm going to put a bullet through your head. You're going to stop. So it's not like you see how, okay, this was a bad pattern of behavior. You're still thinking, I wish I could do that. I just don't want to get shot. So, therefore, knowledge of the virtue is tantamount to the virtue itself. Knowing courage and being courageous are one and the same thing. So that's roughly how his proof that virtue is actually knowledge typically goes. Something like that. And it's a huge cornerstone of his ethics. Any questions on that? Bit strange, but there it is. So that gets us to where Plato leaves Socrates and goes on developing himself. So, quickly summarizing. Man has a nature, and so has excellences. Each nature has a particular excellence. What did it mean to be good scissors or good knife? What did we use before? You have to have the excellence of cutting, and maybe the excellence of durability. So if you have a nature, you must have associated excellences. The things that are somehow in accordance with that nature. Somehow he would say that you robbing each other is violating your very nature. By nature, man shouldn't rob each other. So man has a nature, and so has associated excellences, maybe I should say. He is not solely a product of conventions. There's an actual nature there. It's not just convention. Happiness is a product of a man living in accordance with his nature. Or in other words, achieving these excellences, or cultivating virtues. Cultivating virtue. Man's chief excellences are wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. These are the ones that the Greeks have identified that the people who consistently do these things end up happier. The people who consistently do the opposite end up miserable. So they identify these the same way that you identify eating too much is bad for your health. The cultivation of virtue requires and is the product of obtaining knowledge. Obtaining the proper knowledge then results in happiness. Good?
But it wouldn't be requires because of your punishment example.
Sorry, say that again?
It doesn't require the obtaining knowledge because of your punishment example, where it's like, I'll put your bullet in your head. You didn't gain any knowledge, but you cultivated the virtue of stop stealing.
You didn't really cultivate the virtue. You're not a more happy person because you still want to steal.
You just know because you know.
I didn't somehow make you more temperate.
It's almost like an oppressive method to threaten them.
I'm just counting on the fact that you fear that more than some other thing. Right? I say, I'm going to force you to be courageous. If you try to leave your post, I'm going to shoot you. That didn't make you courageous, but it kept you at your post. Because now you fear the death from me more than you fear the death from the other guy. Maybe. Maybe there'll come a point in the battle where you're like, this is for sure, you're not paying attention, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And so it's still not there. We didn't make you courageous. So all the virtues are attained through knowledge. Now, as a side note, I need to talk about suicide here for a little bit. It doesn't really fit in nice to this whole discussion. But how does suicide fit in for Socrates? Because Socrates thought that, here you are, this soul encased in a body. In a body, you have all the bodily things down here. He's always telling you to look inwards to your soul. And that when you die, you're going to be going to the better place. So the natural question is, well, if death is so much better than life, why shouldn't everyone just go around killing themselves? And so his explanation is, he gives an analogy. He says, imagine that you had a cow. Now, for the most part, you kind of let the cow do whatever you want, but the cow serves some purposes for you. It's your cow. And there will come a point, most likely, maybe not, but there may eventually come a point where you decide it's time for that cow to die. And you're going to get some value out of killing that cow. He says, in a similar manner, you are the property of gods. He put you here. Whatever the purposes are that he gets from you are the purposes he gets from you, but for the most part, he lets you live your life. And he'll decide when it's time for you to die. And you don't get to decide when you get to die. Socrates says, imagine that your cow went and took its own life, but that you still had means of punishing that cow for doing it. Would you punish the cow if you could?
Yeah.
He says, in the same way, I do not recommend that you kill yourself, because God may punish you for it.
Yeah.
Wait till he calls for you to come home, the same way that he's calling for me, so to speak. So that was a side note on suicide and why you shouldn't go killing yourself. God will decide when it's time for you to die. You're God's property. You don't get to decide.
Did we ever go over Plato's religious beliefs?
Tons of times. We just talked about the will of reincarnations, how you can eventually escape that. He has a lot of Pythagorean elements to him.
So Pythagorean was
Huh?
Pythagorean.
He has a lot of Pythagorean elements, Orphic elements, from the Greek deities, the one that seems to have the biggest effect on his thought is Apollo. But yeah, if you want to get a feel for his more religious beliefs, the Phaedo is a great one to read. That's one where Socrates actually drinks the hemlock. That's one where they give a bunch of the arguments for the immortality of the soul, but it's also the one where they spend a lot of time talking about the afterlife and these will of reincarnations and what happens to the good, what happens to the bad, how you lose your memories, and it's got some mythology sprinkled in there. So that's the best place for that. Any other questions before we move on now to Plato? Okay, so now Plato building on top of Socrates. We're going to get to Plato's psychology. Now, psychology by its etymology means the study of the soul. So, psychology is a word much older than the field of psychology. The field of psychology came into existence around 1879 AD. Psychology is a word that we're going to use a lot for Plato. We're going to use it for Aristotle. They're always talking about psychology, the study of the soul.
Why it's not used like that anymore?
Words change with time. Initially, that is what they would have said that they were doing when they set up the field, or what they thought they were doing, largely. And then you start to get the distinctions that we talk about. There's a difference. We would now recognize the difference between an unhealthy soul and an unhealthy psyche. That's not a distinction that these ancient Greeks are going to make. An unhealthy soul and an unhealthy psyche are one and the same. So, note that psychology by its etymology means the study of the soul, and that's how the Greeks use the word. The field called psychology doesn't come into existence until 1879. Now, with Plato, remember we have the world of forms, and we have this world that we're in right now. Man is a creature with elements of both worlds. His soul, which is the essence of a man, is what was here. So you have your soul from the world of forms, and then you have your body composed of the elements of this world. Therefore, man has a higher nature, which is capable of studying the world of forms, and a lower nature, which is concerned with the things of this world. It's the fact that we have that soul, that essence from here, that makes that we can connect with this. It's why you can't teach a chair anything. It doesn't have a soul. But you can teach me. I have the soul. I have that connection with what was here. And so we have these two elements to us, our higher element and our lower element. Now, Plato actually divides the soul into three pieces. So he has a tripartite soul. The soul is the essence of the man and is divided up into three faculties. Now, high level, what is the soul for these Greeks? Soul is the moving principle within you. Remember, it's things that have souls that can initiate action. You are not like a domino that can only fall over if the previous domino hits it over. We don't need to wait for some chain reaction of events to get you to finally cause a motion. You can always choose right now within yourself to do whatever motion you want. You can initiate that motion yourself. That's what they mean by a moving principle. Humans, it seems like animals, seem to have this within them. And so that's what they're talking about when they're talking about things with souls. So the soul is the moving principle within you. And so he's going to divide the soul into three faculties. There seems to be three different faculties within you that try to get you to act a particular way. So the first faculty he calls the logos, or the reasoning faculty in you. This is the part of you that loves truth. This part of the soul is responsible for determining what a man ought and ought not do, as well as obtaining knowledge. The part of you that reasons. The second part of you he calls the thymos. This is the spirited faculty. It's the part of you that loves honors. This is the executive part of a man's soul. It's what actually causes you to action. If you didn't have these parts of the soul and you only had the logos, the reasoning part of you, you would just stand there in contemplation forever, never doing anything else. So this is the executive part of you that actually gets you to act in this world. So this is the executive part of a man's soul. It is what ultimately drives him to action. It's responsible for our passions. And finally, what he calls the eros, or the appetitive faculty. This is the part of you that loves gain. This loves gain. This is the part of the soul that desires pleasures and wishes to avoid pains. It's responsible for the desires for food, drink, money, etc. All your other basic desires in any way you can gain, get ahead. And here's how he divided it up. Now, when you talk about this, it's always common to remind you about the Pythagorean festival analogy. You remember the Pythagorean festival analogy? There's three types of people that go to the festival. You had the best people who are there just to spectate, watch. And then you have the second best people who are there to actually compete at the festival and to try and win honors. And then you have the worst type of people there, the ones there to make money off the whole event. So that's how the Pythagoreans talk about. So your spectators, you can obviously see how that's related to the spectators, that's related to the competitors, and that's related to the people that are selling their goods, trying to make money based off the event. Okay. So how do we know that there are, in fact, 3 separate elements to your soul? Why does he divide it up into 3 pieces? That seems pretty arbitrary. Now remember, your soul is the moving principle within you. So if at one point part of you wants to do A and another part of you wants to do B, those must be 2 different faculties. So your soul is what drives you to action. If some part of you wants to do A and some part of you wants to do B, those must be 2 different faculties. So we're going to show you how the logos, the thymos, and the eros are actually 3 different faculties. There's the reasoning part of you, the passionate part of you, and the appetitive part of you. So if a man is pushed in 2 opposite directions about the same thing and in the same instance, he must be being acted upon by 2 separate faculties. So how do we know that logos and eros aren't the same faculties? How do we know that the reasoning element in you and the appetitive element in you aren't actually the same thing? Well, he gives a simple example. So logos and eros aren't the same because you can conclude that you ought to stop eating and yet still strongly desire to keep eating. So your brain's saying, no, I've had too many calories today. But the appetitive part of you is saying, oh, but that looks good. I want to taste that right now. Those must be 2 separate faculties because they're driving you to make completely opposite decisions. So the appetitive part of your soul, whatever that is, and the logos part of your soul, whatever that is, must be 2 different parts. Similarly, how do we know that the thymos and the eros, the part of you responsible for your passions, the spirited part of you, and the appetitive part of you are the same? So thymos and eros aren't the same because you can desire something, but be angry with yourself for desiring it. Right? Maybe you just started playing this new game, and now it's all you can think about. It's driving you nuts. You just want to go play it, and you're so angry at yourself for wanting to play it so bad. So that's 2 different parts of you. Your soul's telling you to do A, and your soul's telling you to do B, that moving principle within you. Those must be 2 separate faculties in the soul, because they're telling you opposite things. And then finally, your logos and your thymos aren't the same, because you can conclude that you shouldn't do something, and yet do it out of anger. Right? I shouldn't say it to him, I shouldn't say it to him, I shouldn't say it to him. But then he says something that finally just was the last straw. And you just yell at him what you shouldn't say to him. So your logos and your thymos can't be the same. So at the very least, he feels he's proved that there's at least 3 different faculties, and it's the only 3 he could identify. So he feels fairly confident that there's 3 different faculties within your soul. Make sense so far? We did that. Okay, somebody get that. Okay, so man possesses this tripartite soul in which all 3 parts are inherently in conflict with each other. They all naturally want different things. What can we do? So how do we achieve happiness? By cultivating virtue and establishing a harmony in the soul. So we're finally going to get to the definitions of these things. Temperance. What is temperance according to Plato? Temperance according to Plato is when you allow reason to rule over your desire for pleasure. So, what's a temperate act? Here you are, you're served the cake. Your brain says, I've had enough calories, I shouldn't eat the cake. Deciding and refusing to eat the cake, that's a temperate thing to do. Eating the cake anyways, that's an intemperate thing to do. So what is temperance? Temperance is achieved when the desires for pleasures is not allowed to overrule reason. The spirited, or the executive part of you, the part of you that actually gets you to act, the spirited, or executive part of the soul, must side with reason against the appetitive in its desire for pleasure. So your brain says, I shouldn't eat the cake. Your desire says, but I want to eat the cake. If the executive part of you, the passionate part of you, the part that causes you to actually take action, goes with the reason and says, okay, I'm not going to eat the cake, then you're temperate. If you eat the cake anyways, that's vicious. You're intemperate. So that's his definition for temperance. Letting reason rule over your desire for pain. Courage is going to be very similar. It's letting reason rule over your desire to avoid pain. So Let reason rule over your desire to have pleasure. Let reason rule over your desire to avoid pain. Courage. Courage is achieved when the desire to avoid pain is not allowed to overrule the reason. The spirited part of the soul must side with reason as against the appetitive in its desire to avoid pain. So, you know there's mental pains associated with doing your homework. The appetitive part of you doesn't want to do the homework. It wants to avoid that pain. Your reason is saying, no, we should do our homework. If the executive part of you then says, okay, we're going to do the homework. It carries out and does the homework. That's a courageous thing to do. So they mean it more broadly here. Whether it's mental pains or physical pains. Much simpler example. The appetitive part of you doesn't want to get that shot from that needle. The reasoning part of you says, but I don't want to get polio or whatever it is. And so you go and you get the shot anyways. That's a courageous thing to do in a simple instance. So that's temperance and courage. Those usually go hand in hand. Any question about those two? And then wisdom, that's a pretty straightforward virtue. That's just achieved by the cultivation of knowledge.
What's knowledge means? We'll define that.
Yep. We're now past Socrates and strict into Plato.
Is there a distinction between wisdom and knowledge?
You can know 2 + 2 is 4. That does not make you wise.
It's the act of doing it.
Because that's only one particular thing. You may have $1. That doesn't make you wealthy.
So wisdom is not.
If you're wealthy, you have dollars. If you have $1, you're not necessarily wealthy. If you're wise, you have lots of knowledge, but you can get knowledge without necessarily being wise. And ultimately, wisdom, with capital W, if we want to call it that, comes when you get knowledge of this thing, the form of the good. And now you've achieved that wisdom, that highest level of knowledge.
Okay.
Were you here for the epistemology?
Yep.
So, you remember his divided line, getting to the top of the divided line? When he gets to the top of the divided line, that's wisdom, when you come to know the form of the good. Okay, and then finally, the last of the chief virtues, justice. Justice. This is achieved when a harmony is produced in the soul, and each of the 3 faculties are functioning as they ought to. This is the hardest one of the virtues to understand. Reasoning is guiding the overall action of the soul. The appetitive part is communicating the various desires of the body. The spirited part is siding with reason anytime conflict arises between the appetites.
True reason, yeah.
I missed it. Between reason and the appetites. Using the passions as an aid. So, passions can often be a useful thing. You can use them to help drive you to do good things when it sides with your reason. So for Plato, it is good that we have all our various pains and pleasures and passions. All our various desires and passions. It is, however, of crucial importance that we keep them subjugated to reason.
So why is it good that we have our various pains and pleasures?
So, if you didn't have the spirited part of you, the passionate part of you, you'd never be driven to do anything. And you spend your whole life standing there in contemplation until you die. If you didn't have the desires within you, there's good pleasures and there's bad pains. Not all pleasure is bad, there's many good pleasures. And so, if you didn't have that appetitive part in you, you would never been driven to go get those good pleasures to begin with.
Couldn't reason figure that out all by itself? Why do you ever have to have a desire for a pleasure if you can reason that's good for you?
So he might give you examples of each of these and then let's come back to that.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example of each one getting out of hand. So, example of the appetites getting out of control would be obviously someone who way overeats. That's an easy one for us to understand. Of the passions getting out of control, that would be someone who just can't control themselves. And then finally, of an unjust intellectual neglect. Someone who stopped taking care of themselves because they're just focused on whatever intellectual pursuit they're pursuing. I refuse to take care of my health. I refuse to take care of my whatever because I'm focusing on whatever intellectual pursuit I'm focusing on.
On reason too much, or is that what you're saying?
It's not necessarily that you're reasoning too much. It's that you're letting your reason run off following track A when there's these other things that should be focused on right now. It's good to know geometry. It's bad to spend the next 2 weeks dedicating your mind just to geometry and fall over dead.
Yeah.
So your desire for pleasures and pain and to avoid pains, it's good that you have those in you. That's useful to you to live a happy life.
Okay.
And so justice is when all these things are in order and your soul is now in complete harmony.
So
The appetites don't get to control anything, but they give us useful information.
Yeah.
It's very confusing.
The passions drive us to our various actions so that we don't just stand there contemplating, never doing anything in the world. What good would Socrates have been if he just stood in a cave thinking forever? And then obviously the reasoning part is probably the most obvious. What's up?
Justice in modern context, I guess, is often referred to how we, execute punishment and how we manage choices in situations, like when there's inequality happening, fairness. How do you, make just decisions? in
Well,
those situations?
usually that's trying to right a wrong where you've got to re-worry about it. Otherwise, you don't care.
I'm thinking about the seat of a judge and their job to determine guilty or not guilty, and whether or not that choice was justice. That's what I was thinking when you refer to justice, and this seems just completely different.
So think about now a just man. They have the attribute, the characteristic of justice. Here's a just person. What are they like? They're a person who, according to Plato, their passions never get out of hand. They are acting in the world, but their passions never get out of hand. It's always guided by their reason.
So a just man is someone who acts with reason rather than emotion or.
He can act with emotion, but the emotion is aligned with his reason. You might think a soldier, on the battlefield, he knows he's getting kind of scared, so he forces himself to get angry at the other guys to drive him to do what he knows he's got to do. So he uses his passions to try and drive him forward. So it's not saying you don't use emotions. You use your emotions, your passions, the right way. You use your appetites the right way. You use your reason the right way.
But the point is that you don't allow these basically just to control you. You decide what you do based off of reason first, and then if whatever passions you can conjure up to help you do that, right?
Right.
And ultimately, you could probably summarize both temperance, justice, and courage up to just following, keeping a commitment to happy life.
That is what justice is.
Keeping the what that you have in your life?
A commitment, like you have some commitment in your life, it's something that matters to you, and you go out and accomplish it, and you don't let pleasure, pain.
So I don't know that the commitment matters here. You're just using that as what's guiding why you should do it. Your reason says I ought to do this thing.
Exactly. You have a reason of why you want to do something.
Perfect.
And that's your commitment. And you just don't let any bodily function sway you from it.
Yes. You carry out what your reason tells you ought to do, using your passions as your aid and not letting your appetites distract from it.
Okay.
So that's justice. And so with this, Plato says now you achieve a harmonious soul. So justice brings harmony to the soul. You've got all the virtues and everything's acting the way it should. And so now your soul's in harmony and there's no longer anything conflicting with anything. So for Plato, did we already say that? Yeah, we did. Did I answer your question? Okay. All right. So why should we cultivate virtue? To create an internal harmony in the soul, which ultimately produces happiness. That's the goal. What happens if we listen to the sophists? You throw your soul into disarray. You have no internal peace. Remember, going back to Thrasymachus, one of the points that the sophists advocate is it's better to commit an injustice than it is to suffer an injustice. When you suffer an injustice, what do you really lose? Nothing. When you commit injustice, you bring discord into your very own soul, causing you to become miserable. So if you listen to Sophists, you throw your soul into disarray. You are at war with yourself, lacking any internal peace, and you are killing yourself spiritually. This internal turmoil will ultimately drive you into a state of pure misery. Thus, it is better to suffer than to commit an injustice. One of Socrates' most famous doctrines, but that Plato also was committing. He was convinced of that fact. And you might remember, again, when we started the Republic, because this is kind of the conclusion at the end of the Republic. He's all working his way up to this grand conclusion. Because the question was it better to be perfectly unjust, but have a reputation of perfect justice, or to be perfectly just and have a reputation of perfect injustice? And you might remember back when we put that thought experiment forward. Socrates was on the side, it's better to be perfectly just and be perceived as perfectly unjust and have all of society hate you. Better to have perfect harmony inside the soul and a perfectly healthy soul and have everyone around you hate you than to be perfectly unjust, be in a perfectly miserable state, and yet be able to achieve all the desires you have. So, why the just man is happier than the tyrant, and why Socrates pities the tyrant. That poor tyrant, not only is his soul in this disarray, in this miserable state, but since he has so much power, no one can punish the man. So he's as worse off as they get. He's not even lucky enough to get punished. And so no chance of him getting that harmony back in his soul. So when he talks to the sophist says, who's happier than this tyrant? Socrates says, I can't imagine it being more miserable, that poor guy. No, Plato also believed that the external goods that we achieve are a consequence of our internal state. So while the virtuous man doesn't long for the things of this world, it is very likely he acquires them nonetheless. If you act according to virtue, you're going to end up with the good things of life. Understand that the good things of life, we call them goods because somehow they're related to the form of the good, and so cultivating virtues is going to get you, as a general rule, those good things. So he's also with Socrates in the sense that you should do this for your soul, even if you don't do it for your soul and it's just these things in life that you want, this is still the right path for you. Talk briefly now about his ascetics. This is the only slide I have on ascetics. Love and beauty. So love for Plato is our response to beauty in the sense that we're talking about the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's an attraction we have to the form of beauty. That's what love is. So love and beauty go hand in hand in Plato. Love is a major topic of his dialogue, the Symposium, and there Plato outlines how true love can drive us to the form of beauty. Maybe I'll come back and summarize that when we finish this slide if you guys want to take the time to do it. So, how does this go? Here's what Plato says. He says, first, we love an individual for the beauty of their body. Next, we are driven to love the individual's soul. So first, you're just attracted to that person. You get to know them more, and you actually love their soul. The more you love their soul, what you end up loving is the things that they pursue, their soul pursues. So you end up loving the pursuits of their soul, which are going to be these forms up here. And ultimately, you're going to be driven to a love of the form of beauty itself. So first, we love the individual for the beauty of their body. Next, we are driven to love the individual soul. We then are driven to love the beauty in the pursuits of the soul, the things that the soul is pursuing. Knowledge of science, knowledge of the sciences or the forms. And then finally, we are driven to a love of the form of beauty itself. Thus, Platonic love is the love of the form of beauty. Now, what is hard to get from Plato, because these are just all in conversations, is how the form of beauty ties into this framework. In some sense, it seems like it's another form right here, out here, that's connected to the good. And then everything that we love is ultimately somehow implied by that, and it's somehow implied by the good. In other places, it seems like the form of beauty and the form of the good are one and the same. And so I couldn't make a distinction there. So either everything that we love is somehow entailed by the form of beauty, which is somehow entailed by the form of the good, or it is the form of the good, and I couldn't find a satisfactory verbiage to get it one way or the other. Anyways, that's all we'll be doing with ascetics here.
Why so short?
just not much to say on it. And then, I don't know, we can talk a bit about this symposium dialogue if you want. I don't want to go into politics because we're out of time. You good for staying like another 20 minutes? Okay, so talk a bit about the symposium. To understand the symposium, we need to talk a little bit about ancient Greece. Now, if your elementary education was like mine, you were probably under the assumption that there were a lot of gay men in Greece, right? Pretty normal. Okay, this is not the case, but there's something to it, and I'll explain it. First off, when we talk about a man being gay in today's day and age, what do we mean? There's a whole lifestyle associated with that. We don't just mean that he has an attraction to other men. We mean he has an attraction to other men, and he orients his whole life around that thing. We would not expect a gay man to go on, get married, have kids, have a family. That would be very surprising to us. That would not be the norm. These ancient Greeks, they had wives, they had children, they had families. They would, if you say, should you orient your life around your attraction, your sexual desire for this other man, as opposed to all this stuff, they would have one word for that: intemperate. Orient my whole life around this one pleasure? No. Obviously, family, children, this is how you have a flourishing life. And then this is another desire that I have. So they weren't gay in that sense that two guys run off. Right? So that, if it existed, it's very, very, very uncommon. But there was homosexual relationships. So what were those like? Because it's one of the topics in the symposium, and a lot of what they are talking about with love when Socrates gives us outline. So a common thing that would happen is amongst the elites in society, this was not commonplace amongst general Greeks. General Greeks viewed homosexual love as unnatural for the most part. It was an understood practice that went on amongst the elites. Sometimes. So what would be common is there would be some attractive, what's the word I'm looking for? Charismatic youth. And what would happen is a bunch of older men would kind of compete for his attention, kind of like it's a game. And you're trying to win him over and create a sort of mentor relationship with him, where you're expected to give him knowledge, help him make connections early on. You think that there's some up and rising star, and so this relationship's going to pay out for you in the long run. Those were relationships that happened a lot. Occasionally, a sexual element would also evolve in that type of relationship. When this would happen, this was not just like an acceptable thing. It was seen as very shameful, and particularly for the youth to let it happen. But this, they would call the person chasing him the lover, and they would call the youth being seeked the beloved. Okay, so that is the type of relationship that would happen. That's why Greece gets this reputation that it gets. All these married men had families, da-da-da. They would have never thought for half a second. Sacrificing all that for that desire. They knew it was a shameful desire that they would sometimes indulge in. To give you Plato's own words on it, because I was shocked because I used to think like you until someone challenged me on this. I started looking it up and realized I didn't have a clue. One of the primary sources that he used was Plato's Symposium for arguing that this is the case, and you can go read it yourself. It's fun reading. So using Plato as a primary source, but Plato talks about in his Laws, it's the only place I know where he directly takes on the topic of homosexuality. He says it's a shameful act, it ought to be illegal in every city-state, and he viewed it on par with incest. So that's how he viewed it. So this was not a common practice acceptable amongst the masses.
No.
This was something that was known would happen in these types of relationships amongst the elites, and even then it was deemed shameful and something you would keep secret. Okay, you need to know that you would keep a secret, because we're going to talk about Alcibiades, who was one of these people who got a lot of attention. So what's going on now in the symposium? So in this symposium, what's happened is, I can't remember how it starts, but someone won some great victory in some contest. And so a bunch of friends of Socrates are celebrating this great victory. And so the first night, they have a big drinking party, everyone gets hammered. Socrates decides that he'll stay away from the celebrations for the first night, it's going to be a bit much. Second night, Socrates decides he should go celebrate with his friends whatever this great victory was. And so they're doing like a dinner party where they're going to be drinking. And they talk about how, well, we drank way too much last night, so tonight we're going to take it easy. Each man, we're only going to drink what we actually want to. We're not going to have people pressuring each other to drink. We're going to have a relaxing time tonight because we're all still a little hungover. And so that's what they agreed to do. And so what are they going to do when they're all gathered together at the rich man's house where they're celebrating, they decide that in turn they're each going to give speeches to love, some speech praising love, or some speech about love. Sometimes they're talking about love the way you might think about. Other times they're talking about an actual God love. But so there's a bunch of these speeches being given. Eventually, Socrates' speech comes along, and that's where you kind of get this outline. And so that's where I got pretty much all this from. So it's just one of the speeches in there, the dialogue, probably like a 2-hour read. Socrates' speech, probably like 20 to 30 minutes of it. Anyways, just for the sake of continuing how the story goes. So once they go around and do it, there's an interruption at the front door. And they can hear that there's a crowd of a bunch of drunk people out there who want to come in for the party. And the man who owns the house, he says, if you're not sure who they are, or if they seem too wild, tell them that we're already done celebrating and send them away. Otherwise, you can let them go ahead and come in. It turns out that these drunk party crashers are being led by Alcibiades. And he's probably about 25 at the time. And so they're completely hammered. And they decide that they're going to crash this party all in good humor. And so it's there that Alcibiades, when he comes in, he just instantly takes control. He's forcing people to start drinking. He wants everyone as hammered as he is. He's instantly filling up, giving Socrates lots of wine, getting everyone drunk. And then he gives his speech where we get a bunch of our anecdotes about Socrates. So he decides that he's going to tell people everything that he knows about Socrates, because he's one of these people that have had a lot of people pursue him. He thought that Socrates was pursuing him. And then, so he would have these but Socrates would do this with a lot of views, which made Alcibiades mad. He would just engage with a lot of views, creating these types of relationships. So he's talking about how, of all people, Socrates is the only person that ever makes him feel any shame. He says, I had these conversations with Socrates, and he convinces me that all these political ambitions I have, I should set aside and I should focus on my soul. And I am completely convinced when I'm having this conversation with him. And when I walk away from the conversation, I go right back doing the very things that I know I shouldn't be doing. He says, so I can't stand to be here. I don't like being around Socrates, saying it jokingly. He's always making me feel so ashamed. Every time I see him, I feel kind of guilty. Like, oh yes, I should be doing this other thing, but I'm not going to change, and so it makes me feel guilty. So he's talking about his relationship with Socrates, and this is where he gives a bunch of anecdotes, because he's old enough now that he's been on a couple campaigns with Socrates actually out on the battlefield. So he talks about how Socrates would march much better than all the other soldiers. When it was cold, they would all put all their furs on. Socrates, he'd march out with just the same cloak that he always would march with. He talks about how in one particular battle, Socrates saved his life, and then Alcibiades was given an award for heroism at the battle. And Alcibiades told the general, no, this shouldn't go to me, it should go to Socrates. He saved my life. And the general says, well, I got to give it to you basically for political reasons. It makes me look good to those people you're well connected with. And Socrates also told him, no, go ahead, take the honors. So he ended up taking the honors, but he's telling him, well, he didn't deserve it. It should have been Socrates. Talks about how Socrates, even indirectly, so he says he's directly saved my life, but indirectly he saved a bunch of our lives. Because anytime we were in a battle, he fights so fiercely that enemy opponents, when they see him, they instantly go and look for softer prey. And so the people standing right next to him are safer because of how fiercely Socrates fights. So not only has he directly saved my life, but indirectly he saved a few of our lives. And then he then tells the slaves to clog their ears, as he's going to talk about the more depraved things. And he says, and I thought Socrates was after me this way. And he talks about how he attempted to seduce Socrates. He was going to suck him into this relationship. And how he failed to suck Socrates in. All in a drunken speech to this group of people. But he's just a shameless man. He has no shame because he knows how they've all been pursuing him. He's been one of these youths pursued his whole life. And so it's an entertaining read. It's funny. So if you read it, hopefully that gives you some of a big picture of what's going on. And then this is trying to distill the argument for the beautiful that comes out of the Symposium. That didn't take too long. No. Any other questions? We'll end up there without going into the politics.
How much did the Stoic philosophy borrow from this?
So
Plato's philosophy as well.
So, not so much from Plato. Everything that the Stoics have, you can find in Socrates. Everything that Plato had, it also went back to Socrates. Because there's other elements that are very different. For example, the Stoics, they don't believe in free will. Everything that
Stoics don't believe in free will?
no, Yeah, so they believe that there's an infinite number of cycles. You have done everything you're doing right now. I've given this lecture an infinite number of times. This is the infinite time it's happening. I can't remember how long the time frame is, but every 20,000 to 200,000 years or whatever, the universe goes up in flames and starts over again. And so it's very much a duty philosophy, where you got to do your duty, and it's all a matter about how you endure that duty. So it's very much focused on how you respond to the facts of your life and how you think about them and that internal peace you have with your lot in life. But yeah, they're a whole philosophical school in and of themselves.
It's just, I noticed a lot of similarities from the stuff I read from Meditations.
Yeah, you'll see a lot of similarities because just these 4 chief virtues are ingrained in Western culture. And so you're going to see basically any philosophical thought that preaches basically traditional values is going to have these four chief virtues come up over and over again. I think for the Stoics, they rename them a little bit. Like I think they say fortitude instead of courage, and I think they say prudence instead of wisdom, but it's almost the same thing.
Yeah.
So yes, that will very much be the case. Anything else? Cool. Well, we'll end it there, and we will do his politics next time.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome.